Leo Jennings, a former union thug and spokesman for Democrat Attorney General Mark Dan, said, quote, "We have no intention of prosecuting Rush Limbaugh because lying through your teeth and being stupid isn't a crime."
Some of the union bosses get things wrong.
The National Labor Relations Board, now stacked with union stooges.
I've taken on union bosses before.
Hello, my name is Bob Jennings. I guess since I'm the business manager for the plumbers, pipe, refrigeration fitters of Local 246, I'm one of those fat cat union thugs as defined by today's elitist Republican politician. I take offense to this particular portrayal. I never felt that way about my job, nor do I believe that the men and women I have represented for the last 14 years see me in that light. I don't think it's too much to ask for working men and women of this country to earn enough to own their own home, drive a decent car, and assist their children in getting an education if they so desire. It concerns me when I hear Fox News or a Republican candidate degrade me and other union leaders. They do this and then they talk about our citizenship not being on social programs that cost the taxpayers money and having less government and more self-sufficiency. The irony is that the union members are what Republicans describe as what good citizens should be. We train, take care of our own, and ask nothing of the government. We don't want government involved in our business, but because most of them dislike unions, they put more regulations and scrutiny on us than the private businessman. When it's all said and done, a good union member is a good citizen. Now I'd like to tell you a story, and as with all good stories, it begins with once upon a time. Once upon a time, the nation of America was born. Its birth brought hope for the common man in Europe and ultimately the world. The burden of high taxes, poor wages, and working conditions, coupled with religious persecution, made immigrating to the New World and the freedom it afforded very enticing. People uprooted their families or came alone, hoping to prosper and send for their families later. At that time, agriculture was America's greatest commodity. The virgin, fertile soil outproduced the worn-out land of Europe, even better than the immigrants had hoped. It wasn't long until crops such as tobacco, cotton, sugar, and coffee were being shipped back to Europe. Demand for these commodities grew, and some of the founding fathers became very wealthy men. Farming is a very labor-intensive undertaking. It requires many workers to plant, cultivate, and harvest the crops. As demand for the workers grew, so did the wage. The plantation owners felt that they owned the land. They took all the gambles associated with farming. They were offended that a valuable, productive worker could demand high wages. They were also offended to have to share the wealth of abundance that the fertile land provided. Many were getting very rich, but their greed grew. Greed overpowered the landowner's sense of right and wrong, and slavery was born. After all, slavery was already here. With the poor Europeans that couldn't afford passage, they entered into labor contracts as indentured servants. But those expired and they became free men. From a moral standpoint, the African slaves were dark-skinned, not thought much more of than animals, so slavery was acceptable. So much better to ignore how a person was stolen from his or her homeland and sold on the auction block than to pay a livable wage to free men who had the power to walk off and not harvest the crop if the landowner refused to pay a decent wage. The cheap, abundant, seemingly unending labor from Africa tipped the scales, and landowners became richer and richer while the average man struggled. The dawning of the American industrial age was around 1850. In the North, captains of industry began getting rich off the backs of workers and slaves. The problem is that the wealth in the South was in possession of the plantation owners, and the wealth in the North was in the possession of the factory owners. The workers had very little say and even less of the nation's wealth. It was in the hands of a very small percentage of the nation's populations. Fueled by the conflict of the American slavery and the bitter rivalry with the rich in the North and the very rich in the South, the Civil War was born. Abraham Lincoln, a Republican, signed the Emancipation Proclamation as an executive order on January 1st, 1863, to free the slaves in the 10 states that were in rebellion. It was conceived as a weapon to cripple the South's agricultural production and eliminate its ability to fund the war. The Northern slaves were not freed until the 13th Amendment took effect in December of 1865, after Lincoln's death. He held a nation together that was torn apart by greed. He also had a strong sense of importance of the worker. He is quoted as saying, "Labor is prior to and independent of capital. Capital is only fruit of labor and could have not existed if labor had not existed first. Labor is superior to capital and deserves much higher consideration." Lincoln was the catalyst that ultimately freed the slave workers, who were America's most valuable asset at that time, greater than the combined value of the ships, railroads, and factories of the nation. With the Civil War over and agriculture in disarray, the American worker turned to the city for jobs. Factory employment was booming. The American Industrial Revolution was in full bloom and employment was abundant. The growing economy demanded more, and the developing factories were happy to accommodate. The period of excess was born. Greed once again reared its ugly head. The capitalists lived lavishly, and enough was never enough. They were called robber barons, a term that was taken from the Middle Ages that referred to those that stole from the poor and gave to the rich. Names like J.P. Morgan, Rockefeller, Vanderbilt, and others built empires off the backs of workers. The wealth they accumulated still provides their descendants excessive lifestyles even today. Whole cities were built and owned by these titans of industries. A new type of slave was born because you truly owed your soul to the company store. You worked, rented, and bought your food and clothes from the company. If you complained about your wages or working conditions, you were simply let go. Boats arrived at Ellis Island on a regular basis to provide fresh new labor willing to undercut your wages. By 1929, there was a large oversupply of goods no one could afford. For an economy to function properly, total supply must equal total demand. This was not the case. The only thing that drove the economy was credit sales, luxury spending by the wealthy. Does this sound familiar? When credit ran out, the middle and lower classes had no savings. Plants shut down because they had no consumers to purchase their goods. The Great Depression ensued. Probably the best thing to come from the Depression was the realization that the American worker needed to band together and form unions. It was not an easy road because the top 1% had the power and the money. When the Republican governor of Massachusetts, Calvin Coolidge, broke the Boston Police Union, it thrust him into the spotlight and drew the support of the very wealthy. They now had a man that would do their bidding. When he was elected president in the 20s, he was supported in his agenda by a very conservative government and Supreme Court. Laws were passed that cut taxes for the wealthy and took workers' rights away. Does that sound familiar? This plunged our nation into economic ruin. In the end, through great sacrifice, the labor movement achieved monumental strides, and as high as 1/3 of American workers had joined unions. Unions were good for America. Child labor laws were passed, the sweatshops were shut down, and pay was increased so these jobs paid livable wage. The 40-hour work week was established, and weekends became a time for friends and families to enjoy life. Minimum wage laws were passed that had previously been ruled unconstitutional by the conservative Coolidge Supreme Court. The middle class was born. The economy boomed, and our nation flourished. The war machine factories of the 40s were converted, building products that the robust economy and financially stable middle class Americans desired. The age of consumerism was born, and what was not built and sold in this country found thriving markets overseas. Because of the unions and the wages demanded for labor during this time of plenty, America had a huge tax base to pay down its war debt. The typical American had a decent wage to tax, the rich were taxed reasonably, and the economy grew. All social classes lived better. This time of prosperity lasted almost 50 years. America was strong and labor was appreciated. Almost every leader of this nation understood the balance needed for our free society to thrive. FDR brought us out of the Great Depression and through World War II with his great leadership. He understood the importance of labor and unions, and he stated, "It is one of the characteristics of a free and democratic nation that it had a free and independent labor unions." Eisenhower said, "Only a fool would try to deprive working men and working women of the right to join the union of their choice." John F. Kennedy stated, "The American labor movement has consistently demonstrated its devotion to the public interest, and it is and has been good for all of America." Jimmy Carter, he felt that every advance in this half century, Social Security, civil rights, Medicare, aid to education, one after another, came with the support of the leadership of American labor. Even this next guy, at one time, believed in the importance of collective bargaining. I will let him speak for himself.
I will consult with representatives of organized labor on those matters concerning the welfare of working people of this nation. I happen to be the only president of a union ever to be a candidate for president of the United States. They remind us that where free unions and collective bargaining are forbidden, freedom is lost. They remind us that freedom is never more than one generation away from extinction. You and I must protect and preserve freedom here.
Then greed crept back in. The capitalists had found a champion just as they had in Coolidge in the Roaring '20s. A new age of greed and an all-out war against labor and the middle class ensued.
A strike by air traffic controllers. From the President, a strong warning.
They are in violation of the law, and if they do not report for work within 48 hours, they have forfeited their jobs and will be terminated.
Be afraid. Trillions of dollars in out-of-control debt. You know it's those liberals, Democrats, and socialists. Let's pull back the curtain and expose the little men pretending to be wizards in the land of Oz. In World War II, the debt was huge, 120% of America's annual income. But for 37 years, we held it down and grew the country, and by 1981, compared to the national income, it was its lowest in 50 years. Then it went berserk. What happened? First, in 1980, Reagan was elected based on frightening stories of out-of-control debt. He and his supply-siders came to power in 1981. And for the next 15 years, starting with their first budget, the debt spun out of control. This is more than a little fishy. Reagan had economists who saw the same graph. They knew the debt was at its best in 50 years. But they find it useful to frighten the public with the national debt. So when it's not out of control, they claim it is. And when they get the chance, they make sure it goes out of control. So who are the supply-siders? In a posh restaurant 30 steps from the New York Stock Exchange, a conservative Wall Street Journal editor engineered the creation of supply-side economics. By 1980, the supply-siders had converted Reagan, but the elder George Bush had already foreseen the future and called the supply-side prescription voodoo economics. Reagan promised he would reduce the debt faster than anyone. We won't hold him to that, but he should not have raised it faster than our income was growing. The green line shows the debt staying at a constant percent of income. The red line shows he didn't come close. So he blamed Congress, but over his 8 years, Congress appropriated less than he requested. Clinton reduced the debt. Then Bush came in, saw the budget surpluses, and promised to retire nearly $1 trillion in debt, the largest debt reduction ever achieved by any nation at any time. Like Reagan, Bush had no idea what his supply-siders were up to, and they relaunched the debt with his first budget. So, what did the supply-siders invest in with the $9.2 trillion they borrowed? America's future? No way. The money bought tax cuts for the very rich and for corporations. We have nothing to show for it. Voodoo is about Wall Street, not about Main Street. Some debt is still left from World War II, and most is from the supply-siders. But Obama is no supply-sider, so why is the debt still going up? It's hard to stop a runaway budget. Reagan got it backwards, Bush Sr. tried and failed, and it took Clinton 3 years to turn it around. But there's more bad news. Borrowing in good times leaves you trapped in bad times. To reduce the debt, raise taxes and spend less. To reduce unemployment, lower taxes and buy more. Nothing works for both. But would a real patriot let the government borrow and spend in bad times? Let's look back at some tough times to see what Uncle Sam was doing when everyone loved him. After 11 years of the Great Depression, the government finally started spending big on war goods bought from industry. So Uncle Sam borrowed the equivalent of $10.5 trillion in 5 years. And here's what happened. Patriots bought war bonds to help Uncle Sam borrow more. Industry hired Rosie the Riveter and millions more. The Great Depression ended and the country's output doubled. Then we won World War II. And after all that borrowing, Uncle Sam paid down the debt until, yes, of course, until the voodoo started. Supply-siders raised the debt 20 out of 20 years. That can't be just bad luck. Truman, Eisenhower, Kennedy, LBJ, Nixon, Ford, Carter, and Clinton all reduced it. But now, as in the Depression, the path to greatness requires putting America back to work. And the generation that gave 400,000 lives for their country is the generation that showed us how. That was patriotism.
Union membership shrank as Americans became convinced that the problem with this country was unions and the American worker earning too much. Laws were passed that not only allowed but encouraged, through tax incentives, plant relocations to foreign soil. The typical American was led to believe that the capitalists were moving into these emerging economies for future and expanded markets for America. The truth is, the plants were relocated not for additional markets, but to plunder the cheap foreign labor that typically has no rights, has no voice, with very little pay. This, in fact, is exporting slavery, and equivalent to cheap labor brought to this country to kill domestic wages. They're exempt from morality because they are out of sight and thus out of mind of the modern consumer. Now that the middle class is on the verge of extinction and this country has almost destroyed its abundant working class tax base, the rich are still trying to keep the supply side public in the White House. The Republican Party's agenda is the same as it was in the Coolidge era. Nothing changes with greed. It only uses a new sales pitch. You must wake up, America. Learn from history. The first period of greed ended in the Civil War. The second in the Great Depression. How will this period end? This nation cannot stand with most of the wealth in the hands of a few. Labor must vote, get out en masse to encourage everyone to reverse the direction of this runaway train. Jobs must return to this country. The Bush tax cuts for the rich must be allowed to expire in 2013. The only power you have is your vote. I would brag on Barack Obama's accomplishments, but as of today, Mitt Romney is the Republican frontrunner, and he says it best.
And why did he drag his feet on our free trade agreement with Colombia and Panama and South Korea? Because organized unions didn't want it, don't want it. And so bowing to them, he holds off on trade. I don't have to tell you all the things he does for organized labor. Even before his stimulus went into effect, one of the first things he does, just 2 weeks before that stimulus, was to issue an order forcing the government to use only union labor on construction projects. He goes on. He bailed out the automakers in a way that did not follow the normal process of bankruptcy, but instead gave the auto companies to the UAW. Again, the people who had supported his campaign. He, of course, fought for card check. Not getting it, he put in place labor stooges at the National Labor Relations Board. And their action has been to try and make every decision in favor of the unions. I was delighted to hear in my introduction a couple of comments of things I did in Massachusetts. Now, I didn't get as much done in Massachusetts with regards to these policies as I would have liked to have. My legislature was 85% Democrat. And so we battled, and I fought in every way I possibly could to level the playing field. And we had some successes. I'll tell you a couple of them. First of all, they passed a card check law. Can you believe that? Card check was passed in my state, reached my desk. I vetoed it. Despite the fact there were 85% Democrats, we fought hard and were successful fighting against this card check legislation. And then we also had Davis-Bacon-like restrictions in our government contracting. I was able to remove those. I prevented state employees from receiving government pay while they were doing union work. I also stopped the practice of having the state collect money from people's dues or from their wages to go into union dues to go into political action committees. So if I become President of the United States, I will curb the practice we have in this country of giving union bosses an unfair advantage in contracting. One of the first things I will do, actually on day one, is I will end the government's favoritism towards unions in contracting on federal projects and end project labor agreements, and I will fight to repeal Davis.
It is always an honor to spend time with folks who represent the working men and women of America. It's unions like yours that fought for jobs and opportunity for generations of American workers. It's unions like yours that helped build the arsenal of democracy, that defeated fascism and won World War II. It's unions like yours that forged the American middle class, that great engine of prosperity, the greatest that the world has ever known. So you guys helped to write the American story. And today, you're busy writing a proud new chapter. You are reminding us that no matter how tough times get, Americans are tougher. No matter how many punches we take, we don't give up. We get up. We fight back. We move forward. We come out on the other side stronger than before. That's what you've shown us. You're showing us what's possible in America. So I'm here to tell you one thing today. You make me proud. You make me proud. Take a minute and think about what you and the workers and the families that you represent have fought through. So a few years ago, nearly 1 in 5 auto workers were handed a pink slip. 1 in 5. 400,000 jobs across this industry vanished the year before I took office. And then as the financial crisis hit with its full force, America faced a hard and once unimaginable reality that 2 of the big 3 automakers, GM and Chrysler, were on the brink of liquidation. The heartbeat of American manufacturing was flatlining, and we had to make a choice. With the economy in complete free fall, there were no private investors or companies out there willing to take a chance on the auto industry. Nobody was lining up to give you guys loans. Anyone in the financial sector can tell you that. So we could have kept giving billions of dollars of taxpayer dollars to automakers without demanding the real changes or accountability in return that were needed. That was one option. But that wouldn't have solved anything in the long term. Sooner or later, we would have run out of money. Could have just kicked the problem down the road. The other option was to do absolutely nothing and let these companies fail. And you will recall there were some politicians who said we should do that. Some even said we should let Detroit go bankrupt.
In it, he wrote, quote, if General Motors, Ford, and Chrysler get the bailout that their chief executives asked for yesterday, you can kiss the American automotive industry goodbye. It won't go overnight, but its demise will be virtually guaranteed.
You remember that?
So I've mentioned a few things I'll do to help the economy. Regulations, energy policy, tax policy. Let me mention one more, and I know this is the one you find most, in many cases, most interesting, and that's what I'll call crony capitalism. Another policy of this president, which is to brush aside the principles of free enterprise and fair play, and instead to tilt the entire playing field in our economy towards the people who financed his campaign. That, in my view, that kind of crony capitalism we have not seen in this country to the extent we're seeing it in this administration, I don't think in history. And you can see it almost throughout the policies of the administration. One, for instance, trade policy. It's a good thing for American jobs to be able to sell goods to other countries around the world. Even nations like China have figured that out. In the last 3 years, China and the European nations have individually formed free trade agreements or trade agreements with other nations around the world.
Today, I talked about this at the State of the Union. We are doing it today. I am creating a trade enforcement unit that will bring the full resources of the federal government to bear on investigations, and we're going to counter any unfair trading practices around the world, including by countries like China. America has the best workers in the world. When the playing field is level, nobody will beat us, and we're going to make sure that playing field is level. But you know what? I did run to make the tough calls and do the right things, no matter what the politics were. And I want you to know, you know why I knew this rescue would succeed? You want to know? It wasn't because of anything the government did. It wasn't just because of anything management did. It was because I believed in you. I placed my bet on the American worker. And I'll make that bet any day of the week.
You can help write the rest of this story. Vote Union, vote Democrat, vote 4 more years of Barack Obama, because we still need change. Thank you.
Everybody should deserve a chance. So I promise you this, as long as you've got an ounce of fight left in you, I'll have a ton of fight left in me. We're going to keep on fighting to make our economy stronger, to put our friends and neighbors back to work faster, to give our children even more opportunity, to make sure that the United States of America remains the greatest nation on earth.